Your lecturer is Dr. Michael A. Roberto. Dr. Roberto is the Trustee Professor of Management at Bryant University. He earned an MBA and a doctorate in Business Administration from Harvard Business School. At Bryant University, Dr. Roberto has received the Excellence in Teaching Award on 8 occasions, and his innovations in teaching with technology also have earned major awards. In addition to articles in leading professional journals, Dr. Roberto is the author of 2 books: Why Great Leaders Don't Take Yes for an Answer, Managing for Conflict and Consensus, and Know What You Don't Know, How Great Leaders Prevent Problems Before They Happen.
Imagine that you are working in or leading a very successful company. You've been featured in leading newspapers and magazines. They herald your innovative products and services. Your investors are enjoying attractive returns. You're producing strong earnings, and you have competitive advantage over your rivals. I have a harsh truth to share with you. You're unlikely to be on top a decade from now. It's very difficult to sustain competitive advantage. It's hard to stay on top. That's what the evidence shows when we look at companies in a wide variety of industries. In fact, the Kauffman Foundation did an interesting analysis several years ago of the Fortune 500. Fortune magazine each year, starting back in the 1950s, produces a list of the 500 largest firms by revenue. Now, what the Kauffman Foundation did is look at how many of those firms remain on the list as time transpires. So they looked at the original list produced in 1955 and asked how many firms remained on the list 30 years later. Well, 3 decades after the original list was published, we had about 250 of the original 500 firms still among the 500 largest firms in the country. In other words, half of the firms no longer on the list. But then the Kauffman Foundation looked at firms that were on the list in 1995 and looked ahead. How quickly did firms fall off the list in the last couple of decades? Interestingly, they found that it took less than 15 years to get to a point where there were only 250 survivors on the list. In other words, the attrition rate had increased considerably. Put another way, they examined the turnover year by year on the Fortune 500 list. And what they found is while there have been some fluctuations over time, there's been overall a trend, a steady increase in turnover over the last few decades among these leading companies. It's really hard to stay on top. You know, some years ago, Andy Grove, the longtime CEO at Intel, a leading microprocessor company, he wrote a book in which he talked about the notion that only the paranoid survive. He said, as a leader, you have to always be ready to confront new competitive threats and be ready to scan your environment and spot the new emerging rival that might knock you off. If you're not paranoid, you won't stay on top. Let's take a look at what's been happening in just a few industries in recent years. In the movie rental business, Blockbuster used to dominate, and Netflix toppled them. In music, we used to go to stores like Tower Records to purchase CDs or even albums many years ago. Today, young people stream music on a service called Spotify. Most of us, when we're thinking about traveling to another city, we think about getting a hotel room. And yet many people today are using a service called Airbnb, and they're finding a room or an apartment that someone owns and is willing to rent for a short period of time to them in that city. And what about when you're traveling in a city and you need to get from one place to the other and you hop in that yellow cab? Well, today, many people are using a service called Uber. Controversial, but so far, very successful. Only the paranoid survive. In each of these industries, we've seen a disruptive threat come and emerge and knock off or at least threaten the incumbent players who were so successful some years ago. In this course, we'll be trying to understand how, as a new entrant, as an entrepreneur, how do you plot a strategy to knock off the top players in your industry? But we'll also be looking at the perspective of the incumbent firm. If you're on top and you have competitive advantage, how do you sustain it? How do you avoid being Netflixed? How do you avoid becoming your industry's blockbuster? Strategy, that's the topic of this course. How do you define strategy? What does it mean to talk about business strategy? Well, several years ago, A.G. Lafley, the CEO of Procter & Gamble, collaborated with the University of Toronto's Business School Dean, Roger Martin. They wrote a book called Playing to Win, and they defined strategy. They argued that strategy is all about making choices. Choices about where and how you will compete. And that really involves three things. What will you as a company do? And what will you not do? And how will you create advantage over the competition? It's as simple as that. And yet at the same time, so challenging to actually formulate and execute. Why is it important to have a strategy, to be crystal clear about it? They argued that it's important because resources are limited. They're scarce. You can't do everything. And so you have to be very clear about how you're going to use your resources in the most efficient way possible to serve the customers you intend to serve and serve better than anyone else in your business. Now, where did the field of business strategy emerge from? How did it originate? Well, really, you go back centuries to military strategy to understand the concept, right? You have an ancient Chinese military treatise by Sun Tzu called The Art of War, in which he talked about strategy from a military perspective. Many in the field of business have looked to that text and begun to use it to formulate ideas on how companies can build and sustain competitive advantage. How do they beat their quote-unquote enemies, their competitors? Strategy in the business context is really only a few decades old. We can go back to the 1950s and 60s at leading business schools such as Wharton and Harvard, where you began to see people talking about the idea of a competitive strategy. And in fact, interestingly, it was a great business historian who wrote extensively on the topic and began to grow the field. Alfred Chandler was a business historian, and he wrote a classic book in the early 1960s. His thesis, Strategy Drives Structure in Large Organizations. He studied the history of some of America's great corporations of the 20th century. And he noted that as those firms changed their strategies, they also had to change their organizational structure, their systems, and their processes. And he argued, therefore, that strategy really drove structure in the way firms operated. But then in 1970, Joseph Bauer at the Harvard Business School turned that argument on its head. He didn't disagree with Chandler, but he argued that in some companies, structure can also drive strategy. The choices you make about the systems and the organizational structure and the processes and the measurements and reward systems, well, those choices can drive where the firm might go in the future because they drive the kind of ideas that bubble up from below and get to top management about new products and services that they might offer. The modern field of strategy was really initiated by Ken Andrews and his colleagues at Harvard Business School. And they argued that strategy was a pattern of choices that revealed the purpose and goals of an organization. Later, we began to see the influence of industrial organization economics on the field of strategy. Michael Porter was one of those early economists who began to fuse ideas from economics with ideas from management. And he began to introduce other young scholars into the field. And they began to shape our ideas around how we formulate effective strategies, how we build competitive advantage, and how we sustain it. So what's the fundamental question we're going to try to answer in this course? I would argue it's very simple. It's why do some firms perform better than others? To answer this question, we have to look at two factors, and they become a bit more complex. We have to look at industry attractiveness and competitive advantage. Industry attractiveness. Some industries are more profitable than others. In those environments, there are more opportunities for more companies to make healthy returns. Other industries, it's really difficult for firms to make money. So one part of explaining a firm's performance is understanding the environment in which they compete. But we also then have to understand how they compete against their rivals. And do they have advantage over their rivals? Are you able to generate returns above the industry average? That's what we mean by competitive advantage. And can you do that year after year? Now, there are two key questions related to competitive advantage. First, how do you establish that distinctive competitive position and create that advantage over your rivals? But then, the second part, in a way, is much more challenging. How do you sustain that advantage against a variety of external and internal threats? We're in a world where information is readily available. It moves very quickly, and we can get on the internet and learn about our competitors so easily. We have consultants out there helping us benchmark against the competition. What that means is if you've proven that you have a successful product or service, if your customers are happy and your investors are generating attractive returns, guess what? Others are going to try to imitate you. They're going to try to find what you're doing and find a little bit better way of doing it. And they won't stop. Others will try as well, and people will also offer alternative products and services, slightly different than your own, that might attract some customers. People are coming after you. They're trying to imitate and undermine your business. And so understanding how to sustain that advantage is crucial when we talk about business strategy. Now, there are two views of strategic planning. Porter's view is that strategic planning is a crucial process in organizations. He argues for the importance of having an explicit process for formulating strategies, for understanding what the goals are of the corporation and how you intend to achieve them. But some have been much more skeptical and critical of the idea of strategic planning in organizations. Russell Ackoff has a wonderful quote that describes his view and his cynicism about corporate strategic planning. He says, "Most corporate planning is like a ritual rain dance. It has no effect on the weather that follows, but it makes those who engage in it feel that they are in control." Now, it's important to note here that Ackoff is criticizing the strategic planning process in many companies, and I would agree with him. Those processes, especially in large organizations, tend to be very bureaucratic and cumbersome. They take a lot of time, and they actually aren't really about formulating strategy. What happens in the strategic planning process in many firms? Well, there are lots of arguments about exactly what the financial target should be. What should we be trying to achieve? What market share will we have next year? What earnings will we generate? How much revenue should we set out to achieve? But that's not strategic planning. That's really budgeting or the programming of a strategy. Strategy formulation is about making tough choices about how to compete and where to compete. And unfortunately, Ackoff is right. In many corporate strategic planning processes, they don't actually talk about making those tough choices. They argue over financial targets and budgets, and that's not strategy. Some have also criticized the field of strategy by arguing that it's simply not appropriate to talk about establishing and sustaining competitive advantage in today's turbulent environment. Rita McGrath at Columbia has argued that competitive advantage is transient. It's not something you can sustain. It's simply too difficult, she says, for firms to establish an advantage and sustain it over a long period of time. In other words, she says, you have to adapt constantly. You have to manage a pipeline of initiatives, not one set strategy. You have to experiment, you have to iterate, you have to learn. Adapting is what great firms do, not plotting a distinctive position and trying to sustain it. Now, Roger Martin from the University of Toronto, he disagrees with McGrath. He says, don't confuse strategy with strategic planning processes. Yes, you have to adapt and iterate, but you have to begin with a clear set of choices. You have to know what direction you're headed in. Now, from there, you can adapt. But managers, he says, sometimes embrace this adaptive view because they don't want to make hard and perhaps uncomfortable choices. But a great strategist makes those tough choices, and they know where they're headed. Now, they're open to adapting, but they start with a clear sense of direction. Now, Martin and McGrath, they actually don't disagree as much as some have noted that they do. If you actually look at what they're saying, they both fundamentally agree that strategy ultimately is about making choices about what to do and what not to do. And Martin would agree with McGrath that competitive advantage is more fleeting today than it was decades ago. It's harder to stay on top. He just thinks we can't start with a view that you're constantly adapting. You should start with a view that says, here is the clear direction I intend to go in. But then I'm going to listen to the market and to the customer, and I'm going to scan the competition and be ready to flex that strategy appropriately. Now, you might ask, Can I go into a company and can I find a document that says, here's how Dell intends to compete in the computer market? Or here's how Ford Motor Company intends to compete in the automobile market? Is the strategy written down somewhere? And can I find it, read it, and understand it? In other words, is strategy formulation always explicit, conscious, and purposeful? Did Michael Dell have it all figured out in his dorm room when he began to enter the computer market as a young man and dropped out of college to build his company? Did each of these entrepreneurs that we might look at in the course, did they all have it figured out in advance? Did Sam Walton know exactly where he was headed when he launched Walmart stores? I would argue that in many cases, they did not. Yes, we can find some entrepreneurs who had a business plan, who wrote down exactly what they intended to do, and they executed it. But in most cases, we see a lot of adaptation and change, and not everything was thought through in advance. You know, James Bryan Quinn of Dartmouth once wrote that he went out and studied a large automobile manufacturer, and he talked to a senior executive there who said to him, "When I was younger, I always conceived of a room where all these strategic concepts were worked out for the whole company. Later, I didn't find any such room. The strategy may not even exist in the mind of one man. I certainly don't know where it's written down. It's simply transmitted in the series of decisions made." I think you'll find that in a lot of companies, that you can't actually find the strategy written down. You may find a strategic plan, but again, that looks more like a budget and a set of targets, not a clear description of what we will do, what we will not do, and how we will compete. In other words, what we can argue here is that sometimes strategy is very deliberate. Sometimes we know exactly where we're headed, and we've got everyone executing that strategy. Sometimes, if you look today at where a firm is, you actually realize that the strategy emerged and evolved over time. In fact, some of the ideas may have bubbled up from below, not been generated in the executive suites. Some strategies are clear at the outset, and others go through many iterations. It's not right or wrong to pursue a deliberate strategy. It's not right or wrong to have emergent strategy. It's simply the reality that sometimes strategy formulation is very explicit and purposeful and conscious, and sometimes it's much more evolutionary. It's why it's important to think about strategy as a pattern in a stream of decisions and actions, something that unfolds over time. It's not an event, but a process. Now, throughout the course, we'll actually look at two levels of strategy. In the first series of lectures, we'll be talking about business unit strategy. We'll be looking at a particular company and how it tries to beat its rivals in a particular product market, how to compete to win. But then we'll also, later in the course, beginning with a case study about Disney, be looking at the concept of corporate strategy. Here we'll be looking at what we call multi-business unit corporations, diversified companies that operate in a variety of product markets. And we'll be looking at the choices being made at the corporate office, not the level of the business unit. We'll be asking, where did they choose to compete? Why did Disney choose to compete in theme parks and movies and retail stores and consumer products? In the early part of the course, it's all about how to compete. How does the theme park business defeat its rivals? On the corporate strategy question, it's why that portfolio of businesses all under one roof. Martin and Lafley say, as you plot this strategy, you really have to ask yourself 5 key questions. What's your winning aspiration? What are you trying to achieve? Right? What's the vision here? Number 2, where will you play? In what product markets? In what segments of those markets? In what geographies? And what's your target market? What customer are you trying to serve? Third, how are you going to win? What is it that you're going to do that's going to give you an advantage over the competition? Fundamentally, that's going to make you different. And then the last 2 questions are about how you're going to get there. The 4th question they ask is, what capabilities must be in place? What's it going to take to execute this strategy? A strategy that's just a great idea in the heads of men and women at the top of a corporation is not going to lead to high performance. You have to have the processes, the systems, and the capabilities to get there. And so the 5th question is, what management systems are required to implement this strategy? How will you measure performance? What kind of technological systems will you have? How are you going to monitor and control different parts of the organization? Those management systems are crucial to getting things done. Ultimately, the winner in the marketplace is not the one with the best ideas or even necessarily the best product. It's the one who can plot that strategy and then implement it very efficiently and in a timely manner, because markets move fast. And if you can't act quickly and execute that strategy in a timely fashion, you won't win. Now I want to turn to 4 key facts about competition that will set the stage for our analysis of competitive environments and of the companies that are trying to win in those environments as we move through the course. Here are the 4 facts. The first, industries vary widely in their profitability. This is a really important point. Warren Buffett once said, when an industry with a reputation for tough economics meets a manager with a reputation for excellent performance, it's usually the industry that keeps its reputation intact. In other words, if you're in a really tough business, it's going to be difficult to make money no matter how smart the management team is. And even if you think you have a great strategy, because frankly, for many years, that business has been one where the fundamental economic forces are causing profitability to be low. So industries vary widely in their profitability. In fact, some studies show that the median return on invested capital across all industries is probably in the low teens, maybe 12 to 14%. But the distribution, well, it's really interesting. There are some industries that over time generate virtually no returns. That's not one company. That's all companies in the industry are looking at cumulative profit of virtually zero. On the other hand, we can find some industries where they're generating incredible returns on invested capital year after year. So this first fact is really important. Industries vary widely in their profitability. And the second related fact is that the industry you're in matters a great deal. What does that mean? That means sometimes there are forces beyond your control driving your profitability. So if you're in the newspaper business today, as the web has grown and as the business is fundamentally transformed, well, no matter how smart your strategy and how capable your management team, your profitability is being driven in large part by greater forces beyond your firm at the industry level in your competitive environment. So industry matters a great deal. There are often things beyond your company's strategy that will drive profitability. The third key fact, competitive advantage certainly may be fleeting, and we've argued that it's really hard to stay on top. If we look at a ranking of the top firms in an industry, and by top I don't mean the highest market share, I mean the highest profitability. Well, if you look at that today, and then look at it 5 years from now, the list may look quite different, and the leader may very well not be the leader any longer. But what about industry structure? If we look at which industries are really profitable today, and then look 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, we see the industry structure tends to be much more stable. The high profit industries tend to be high profit industries over time, and the low profit industries, they don't tend to turn it around very quickly. And the structure, how concentrated the industry is. In other words, is the industry one where a few firms dominate or not? That structure tends to be more stable than competitive advantage. Competitive advantage, that can change really quickly. And finally, the fourth fact, industry structure varies widely around the world. You don't have situations where industries look identical in country after country. Yes, we live in a more global world, and yet there are profound differences. So we see some industries that look very fragmented in one country and highly consolidated in others. So be careful when people talk about a global industry. Yes, global trade occurs, but industries and competitive environments can look very different in different parts of the world for a variety of reasons, stretching from consumer tastes and culture to government regulation and institutions and even forms of government. Now, let's take a look at an example to understand these two drivers of profitability, industry structure and competitive advantage. If we looked at the financials for two companies, we'd see something interesting. Let's take Pfizer, a pharmaceutical company, and Alaska Air, an airline company. In 2013, the return on assets for Pfizer, 12.8%. For Alaska Air, 8.7%. Can we conclude from that that Pfizer is a better managed firm than Alaska Air? Be careful, you cannot. You can't just look at the absolute financial returns for these two companies. Why? Pharmaceuticals is a high profit business. Airlines, it's a low profit industry. So if you actually look more deeply, what you'd find is that Alaska Air is outperforming rivals within its industry. That's the key comparison you want to make. Alaska Air has competitive advantage. No, it's not as profitable as Pfizer, but it's in a much tougher environment. It's like a football team playing in a much tougher division. And that's what we have to remember. We're looking for companies that generate excess returns relative to the industry average. That's competitive advantage. So 2 fundamental drivers of superior long-run returns on investment. An attractive industry structure, an environment where the forces are such that profits are there to be made, and competitive advantage. Can we beat our rivals? Can we have a distinctive competitive advantage, a position that we can defend? Now, this is not to say that economics and financial returns are the be-all and end-all for companies. Yes, we have other goals as a company. We want to serve our customers and have an engaged workforce. We want to do things that preserve and protect our environment. There may be other goals, but if we don't make money, it's hard to achieve those other goals. And so we will be talking about financial returns throughout the course. Now, one other note about industries that's really important. As we look across industries, we also see that in some industries, the leader in one year is much more likely to stay on top than in other industries. What do I mean by that? In other words, competitive advantage is fleeting, but it's more fleeting in some industries than others. If you're in semiconductors or computers or electronic components, fast-moving technological industries, well, the chances that someone who's on top today will be on top 5 years from now are much lower than if you're in a more mature, low-tech business, say like beverages or cigarettes or paper mills. So there's real differences in the persistence of high profits in certain industries. We have to be aware of that. Are we in a turbulent environment or a more stable environment? And that will dictate how quickly we have to be ready to adapt our strategy. Remember what Martin and McGrath were arguing about. How important is it to adapt, to evolve, to iterate, to experiment? Well, in certain industries, it's much more important to do that because it's much harder to stay on top than in others. This is not to say that any firm should become complacent. Everybody has to be scanning their competitive environment, looking for the next new threat. We're going to give you some tools in this course for how to do just that. Now, I may have made some of you think, my gosh, I'm in a really tough business. I'm in one of those industries that the professor mentioned are very low profit and have been for many years. Does that mean I should just throw up my arms and go home? Do I need to find another job or exit this industry? You don't. In fact, you can make money in lousy industries. Let's take the supermarket business. It's not exactly a high earnings business. Many firms fight to scrape by to generate very thin, low single-digit returns on assets. So it's a tough industry. But does that mean everyone is facing the same predicament? Not at all. If we look at major competitors in the business, we still see variation in returns. Whole Foods Market in 2012 generated an 8% return on assets. Kroger, 2.6%. Super Value, it lost a lot of money. It was in deep trouble. So even though the industry as a whole is generating thin margins, we see wide variation across major competitors. What does this tell us? Whole Foods has found a way to build a strong competitive advantage in an otherwise structurally unattractive business. Well, that's really neat. And as we go through the course, we'll want to look at some companies who have done just that. Because we can learn a lot more about strategy by studying companies in really tough businesses and understanding how they achieved a distinctive position and won, than we can by looking at companies where lots of other players are generating healthy earnings as well. In other words, let's go to the extreme, to the tough businesses, and let's find the winners. Now, we won't only do that, but we will do that in a number of cases because it will help us. But remember, it's hard to stay on top. The winners today are not likely to be the winners a decade from now. So we'll use some examples of successful companies throughout the course. But I'm not at all promising they will be successful 5 or 10 years from now. In fact, I'm predicting they won't be. So we have to be careful about the lessons we draw and about assuming that companies that are successful today can continue that record of success. So what's coming next in the course? We're going to dig into a framework for how to analyze an industry and understand its profitability. We've noted that there are these big differences between certain businesses, that some industries are more profitable than others, but we haven't explained why that is. And we need to do that. And importantly, we're going to help introduce a framework through case studies of several industries that help us explain why some industries are very high profit and others are not. That framework will be simple yet powerful, and we'll have you practicing that framework and applying it within just one lecture. And it will have more uses than just understanding why some industries are more profitable than others. The framework will help us formulate strategy. Why? Because it will help us identify threats and opportunities in our environment. It will help us understand what the barriers are to making good earnings. And it will help us think about how we might position our firm within a segment of a business where maybe there's more money to be made, or how we can buttress our firm against some of those really prevailing headwinds that could threaten us. And that's important. So you have an assignment. At the end of each lecture, in fact, in the course, I'm going to give you a small assignment. In order to really learn these ideas, you need to practice them. Learning by doing is more powerful than just listening to what I have to say. So I'd like you to take the ideas and apply them at the end of each lecture. A few moments to listen, to integrate and synthesize what you've heard, and then go out and look at some case studies and try to apply the ideas. So before the next lecture, consider two industries, the airline business and pharmaceuticals, and ask yourself the following question. Why might it be that airlines have been so unprofitable over many, many years? And why is the pharmaceutical business so incredibly profitable? And it has been for decades. You don't know yet how to answer that question, but you can begin to tackle that question. And in the lectures to come, we'll give you the frameworks and concepts to help you distinguish industries that look like airlines from those that look like pharmaceuticals. We look forward to some great discussions ahead.